Hello and welcome to this event hosted by Waterstones. I'm Kirsty Logan and I am the author of some of these books that you can see behind you. There's The Gracekeepers, The Gloaming, and my new book is Things We Say in the Dark. And I'm very excited to be speaking to one of my favourites, Laura Purcell.
Hi, I'm Laura Purcell, as Kirsty very kindly introduced me. I'm here to talk about my new book, which is coming out in January. It's The Shape of Darkness. I've got a little proof copy here. It's about a silhouette artist who is working in Victorian Bath, and her clients start to die in mysterious ways. So she enlists the help of a spirit medium, hoping that she can contact the dead and find out exactly what happened to them. So I've got a short reading for you. I'm going to read from the screen, so I'm sorry if this looks creepy, but I'm just intent on the screen. It's yeah, I haven't memorized it or anything. So it's following the spirit medium, Pearl, as she performs one of her very first séances. Slowly, slowly, Pearl eases the curtain aside and steps out into the darkness. There's always that little shock, the intake of breath when the mourners see her. But today, respect mingles with their awe. She has the power. They can see it flowing from her in waves. Beside her, they're desolate things, pinched and tear-stained, their clothes blending into the false night of the parlour. She takes her seat. No one can see how her knees tremble beneath the tablecloth. Gingerly, the women stretch out their fingers and clasp hers. We'll begin with a hymn. Myrtle insists upon this, says hymns help to convince people they aren't taking part in something sacrilegious. Pearl doesn't join in but sits, staring into the crystal ball. She's always thought it cruel to make mourners sing. If there's one thing she understands about grief, it's how it chokes, the fingers of death squeezing the throats of the living. At last, the hymn ends. The air grows taut. What now? Remembering Myrtle's instructions, Pearl releases the mourner's hands and takes up the gentleman's glove upon the table. Her vision is clouding, as if she's gazing through fog. She opens her mouth and exhales. A luminous ribbon flows out of it, drawing gasps. Her pulse goes wild. This has never happened before. The ghosts are coming. Her arms are glowing, her breath is glowing. She's being swallowed. Myrtle says, "He's here." Something whispers, soft in her ear. Then cool, feathery hands touch her, dozens of them stroking her hair, patting her arms. She wants to scream, but there's a buzzing sensation in her jaw, holding it shut. A figure rises from the mist. He's trailing garments and has candle flames for eyes. Can Myrtle see him too? She doesn't know. The others are invisible to her, and she's alone in the dark with this thing. The spirit parts his lips, revealing a great void. Pearl can't take any more. Her mind pulls the shutters down. Du, du, du.
I can't wait to talk about ectoplasm. That's very
All our favourite things we get to discuss today.
definitely, I'm really excited.
And you're going to give us a reading too, Kirsty?
Yes.
One of your wonderful short stories?
Yeah, I'm going to read from Things We Say in the Dark. I'm going to read you, it's a whole story, but it's a very short one. And it is called I'll Eat You Up, I Love You So. And I would say maybe if you are eating, just for a minute. Oh, you have always been so delicious. Since the days of your babyhood, when you lay on the rug, fresh washed and kicking the air, grown-ups couldn't help but squeal and bring you to their mouths and kiss you and kiss you and kiss you. Your tiny little toes like cocktail sausages. Your legs fat and juicy as a roasted chicken. Your sweet little belly button dusted with sugary baby powder. Your cheeks icing pink, your eyes chocolate brown, your mouth a cherry pout. You're a whole meal from toe to top. As you get older, you won't grow less delicious, just differently delicious. A sugar sticky child to a ripe fruit teenager to an elegant platter of a woman. You will paint and arrange and scent every part of your body so neatly, a cordon bleu chef serving up yourself. You can't blame them for wanting you, can you? It's just a little taste, just a nibble, no harm done. A single mouthful, savoured and swallowed. But you're not there yet, still so little and edible, toddling on your pork chop legs, grasping things in your fat, salty fists. All the aunties and uncles arrive in a mass and swoop you up, cooing and squealing, "You're so gorgeous, so perfect. Can you imagine ever being so little and perfect?" Oh, they could just eat you up. They said they would. Although you couldn't talk back, you understood what they said. And you knew it was just a joke, a strange grown-up joke, the way grown-ups always did strange things. But they did say, "You were fair warned. You may kick your little meat legs, and you may weep your seasoning tears, and you may cry for them to put you down, but it's too late now. Their mouths are so big, and they open them so wide, and inside their teeth are so sharp, and they love you, they love you, they love you so."
I love that story so much.
Do you know what I was thinking? I've actually got a story in here about a séance. I should have.
Oh, you do, don't you? No, but that one's great. I mean, this is the thing, there's so many good stories in your collection. I can't pick just one that I love. I think I love the Doll's House one as well. But
That's a strange one. But let's talk about séances then. I would love to hear more about this because it's very clear from this book. Because I too got a sneaky peek of this book, so I was very excited to read it. And it's clear that you've done a lot of research for this. So can you talk a little bit about the research?
yeah, so I guess like for today, it's going to be really interesting for us both to talk about the role of women in spooky things, because most of the seances, in the Victorian era were female led, and your book focuses primarily on female fears, though I think a lot of those fears are also universal. But yeah, women in seances really fascinates me. I think the starting point I'm really interested is that they seem to think in the Victorian time that a lot of sort of lower class, physically weak women were the ones that had the greatest power. So,
Oh.
these are people that would normally not have much power at all, in terms of society. And they were suddenly being given center stage, prized for being lower class, for being young, for being powerless normally. And suddenly they were thrust into the spotlight and able to speak and act in ways that would be frowned on by society usually. And suddenly there's this big reversal. So I think in a way it was a really big opportunity for a lot of women to explore new ways of existing.
So the more apparently powerless you were or seemed, the more power you would have as a medium.
Yes, I quoted in my book something that I'd read. Actually, I've got it with me, The Darkened Room. If you ever get a chance to read this, The Darkened Room, it's all about spiritualism in the 19th century. It's amazing. Um, and someone said the perfect breeding ground for mediumship was discontent, poverty, and disenfranchisement. That is apparently the perfect ground for becoming a spirit medium. That's where the power is meant to bloom from, which really interests me. And you notice that a lot of the spiritualists they were bringing to the fore as time went on were these young, pretty uh, children in some respects. I mean, I think you and I were discussing Florence Cook and her manifestations of Katie King, and Florence Cook's younger sister subsequently went on to be a medium as well, almost as a kind of rival, which I found really interesting.
Hmm. So who was more successful of the two?
I think Florence still was. But I liked this idea that, you know, Florence was like the first, and then suddenly some of these younger, perhaps more attractive models were being pushed forward by their patrons. I don't know, I mean, what did you find about Florence when you were studying her? Because you did a radio show recently about
Yeah,
this.
a Radio 4 show, yeah, 10 episode show. And one of the episodes was all about Victorian spiritualists. And of course, Florence came up a lot. And I also found that really fascinating that it was these women who usually would really not have a lot of options of what they could do with themselves. There really weren't a lot of ways for sort of lower middle class women in particular to make money. If you didn't marry into money, then you didn't have a huge amount of options really. So I found that really fascinating. And the fact that the seances happened in their houses as well, I thought was interesting. And that's what I wanted to do in the story. So the story in the book that's about seances is not actually set in Victorian times, it's set in modern times. And it's called Girls Are Always Hungry When All the Men Are Bite-Sized. All the stories have very long titles. And there's lots of things about eating, I've realized. Maybe I was hungry writing it or something.
You were hungry when you wrote it.
Obviously, it must have been, yeah. And it's in a very small house. They live in a place that's called a spite house, and this was something that came up when I was researching. A spite house is a real thing, a real phenomenon of houses that are built for spiteful reasons. So they're built to block access or to block light to other buildings. So
I love this.
yeah, often they're not very functional. So sometimes people live in spite houses, but they're usually, they might not have electricity or running water. They're usually very narrow, very dark, very uncomfortable. So like even living in them, I imagine you would just be full of spite all the time. But not only was your house built for spiteful reasons, but now you have to live in it in this really horrible
I
place.
love this. The whole reason to exist is just to be petty. That's just brilliant.
But then, you know, I suppose there's a good lesson in there, because if you're the one that has to live in it, then who really suffers the most? Probably
Yeah,
you. The spiteful person
very
suffers
true.
the most, really. So in this story, they live in this spite house, which is this very narrow house that's built in the alley between, in a row of terraced houses. They've just put this house up in this place where there shouldn't really be a house. And they run these seances, and in the story, they are fake. They are faking them on purpose. They don't believe that any of it's real, but then strange things start happening, which is a setup that we've seen before, but it's one I'm particularly fond of. I really like it a lot. But I would love to come back to what you were saying about female fears, because what has got me thinking is talking about power and being powerless. And I wonder about women and horror, because it does seem like a lot of women are writing horror right now, perhaps not horror in the genre sense that we might think of, you know, the classic Stephen King, big books of the 80s and 90s, but maybe a different type of horror. And do you think that's about power? Are we trying to have power over our fears?
That's really interesting. Yeah, and I think spooky writing, gothic writing is and reading to some extent is a way to deal with your fears, because it's kind of a safe space to explore things. And I think if you read enough scary books, you kind of get a little bit hardened to to them, and you do start to conquer your fears. So I think that could be a way. But yes, I think with the kind of domestic horror that we're seeing, um, kind of more women's experience of horror in real life is really interesting. Um, and yeah, I mean, you were saying like about specifically female fears, and I think something that occurs in your book quite a lot is the theme of childbirth and just the apparatus of of being a woman. And I think obviously that the oldest female fear is when you're a kid, and you're told at some point you're going to start bleeding each month, and you're like, wait, what? this, this is suddenly this uncontrollable thing. And a lot of my friends have had some real, not to get too personal, but real gynecological horror stories. And I think that is something quite specific that perhaps hasn't been talked about. It's been quite taboo, that women are starting to reclaim and explore, and sort of to say, well, actually I was traumatized by my childbirth or whatever. So that's something that's really interesting, and I think in a way we're trying to take control of that.
Yeah, I just think there's so much there that not only are a lot of women, I mean, who can speak for all women? Nobody can, but I think a lot of women are very afraid of a lot of things around this subject, but also that we're told over and over that we mustn't talk about it. So, for example, the whole middle section of the book is all about fears to do with pregnancy, childbirth. And I think I don't have children, but I just think there's so many fears, because I think when I was younger, I feared being pregnant when I didn't want to be. And I think now that I'm getting older, I'm afraid of wanting to be pregnant and not being able to. Or I fear that I will be pregnant and something will go wrong, or I fear that it will go great and I'll have a child, but then something will be wrong with the child. The child will get ill, or something, or will hate me, or just anything. So many things that could go wrong. And I think there are just so many fears, but we're told not to talk about them. And I've been thinking a lot about this, because actually while I was writing the book, my wife and I went through a miscarriage, and it kind of at the 10-week point, which the 10-week scan is when you're supposed to tell people, but we were so excited that we had told people. And I did get some, mostly people were very, very kind about it, but a few people did say, not quite in these words, but they essentially said, oh, that's why you shouldn't tell people before 10 weeks, because then you have to tell people if it doesn't, because miscarriage is incredibly common in those initial 10 weeks. And it just got me thinking so much about it. And I've spoken to my wife about this, and she's fine for me to kind of speak about it publicly, but just that there's this idea that I always thought that there was some kind of medical reason that you weren't supposed to tell anyone before 10 weeks, but it's purely so that if it doesn't stick, which is very common, you won't have to then tell everyone that you're not pregnant anymore. And it just made me think so much about, why shouldn't we tell people? Because we didn't want to pretend like nothing had happened. Our family and friends, why should we pretend there was no loss?
It's kind of saying you're not entitled to that support. Like, because I think you need to tell people, and they need to be aware, that you were excited about this child, and then that you've had this devastating loss. I mean, your support network absolutely need to know that in order to support you. It's kind of saying, no, you should just suffer this in silence. You should just go on, smile, be happy, and don't let anybody know you're suffering, which is the worst. I mean, just from a mental health perspective, that is the worst thing anyone can possibly do.
And you get that so much with periods as well. I have quite a few friends who really have a lot of problems with their periods, and it's very difficult to know at which point is this an actual medical issue. At what point is it just periods suck? And at what point is it, no, there's actually something that I should be getting some kind of a treatment for, or doing something about. And I think, again, it's like, oh no, taboo, periods, we mustn't discuss periods, it's disgusting. And you're like, is it? Why is it disgusting? It's just a completely natural process that many women and trans men and non-binary people go through a really large portion of their lives, but it's we mustn't speak of it.
It's insane, isn't it? It is completely insane. And like you say, if you don't talk with your friends and family about it, how do you know when something's unusual? I'm a sufferer of endometriosis, and I was just for a long time undiagnosed, thinking, no, it must be perfectly normal to be in this absolutely crippling pain and need 2 days off work every month. I'm sure this is normal. And then I started to realize it wasn't. But yeah, you're right. It's that kind of opening Pandora's box in a way, these kind of secret fears that women have been told to kind of keep down and repress, coming to the fore. And I think, another really interesting thing is perhaps the role of carer that is often thrust upon women. Obviously men can be brilliant carers, but it's not kind of indoctrinated from an early age that you have to be a good carer. And I think what comes out in some of your stories as well is this idea of trying to look after people and things, and not being a good custodian, and these things going out of control, and it's all your fault because you were meant to be caring for them, in this kind of angel with the lamp way.
That's a good point. Yes, I hadn't thought about that before, but yeah, like in the Gracekeepers, the main character North, she long story short, she dances in a post-apocalyptic circus on a world boat, like one does. Yeah, but she's supposed to be in control of this bear, and you can't control a bear, you can't control a wild animal. And why should you? Why don't take a bear in a boat, folks? It's not It's not, they don't like it.
Who would have thought?
I don't imagine that they like it. I haven't tried. But so that's interesting because I think in your books, because I've read all your books at this point. So,
Oh, what a star.
but I've noticed in a lot of your books, there's a focus on women. I think not so much that they aren't in control of things, but that they are trying very hard to be what they think other people want them to be, which is interesting. And we're talking about female fears. And do you feel like,
Mm.
is that one of a uniquely female fear or a specifically female fear?
I don't think it is specifically. It's hard. I don't know. I don't think there are any specific female fears, but there are definitely fears that are more prevalent
Mm.
amongst females. Does that make sense?
Mm.
So yeah, there's a character in The Shape of Darkness called Myrtle, and she's had responsibilities put upon her from a really early age. Her mother died in childbirth, so she's raising Pearl, who she thinks has the power to communicate with the dead. Um, but she's got a stepfather, but she was expected upon the death of her mother to take over looking after the baby, to take over all the household. And then as her stepfather gets ill, she's increasingly meant to provide financial support for the family as well. And exploring her character was really interesting because I thought it is just presumed in this way, especially in the Victorian time, that that this is what the woman will do. The woman will look after the baby, look after the house, and that's not necessarily what she wants to be doing. She's got some ideas elsewhere, but she has to live up to what's expected of her.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to talk about the role of women in horror stories because I am very interested in this and this idea of the, why does horror appeal to women? Because some people seem really surprised by this because I think there's this misconception that horror is inherently misogynist and horror is anti-women. We might think of those slasher films where the woman gets stabbed and she's sort of running around in her underwear crying, and we might think that that is horror, and I mean that's a part of horror, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that. So any thoughts about the women in horror, if that's not too big a topic?
Lots of thoughts about women in horror. I've always found women in horror quite empowering, actually. I mean, yes, it must be said, there's kind of Robert Layman kind of books. There's a lot of violence against women. Um, but there's also a lot of horror, especially recently, that's quite, I think, empowering to women. I recently watched The Invisible Man. I don't know if you've seen it.
Oh, good.
It's really good. And it is just so, the woman faces the horror, but she comes out stronger. And I think with the final girls, even things like Scream, the woman is kind of quite kick-ass in a way. So I've always found it quite empowering to watch women in horror. But I also think the characters are so much more interesting. I'm starting to watch Ratched on Netflix, based on Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And, having this very dark female character, it's just really, I find it really exciting. And it must be exciting for actresses to be able to explore, just more interesting characters, I think, that have this darkness that's traditionally been avoided in lots of female characters.
Like a woman that doesn't have to be nice.
Yeah, that's it. Unlikable woman. And I think I said to you, and I'd be really interested for your thoughts on this, because I love a female villain. And I find female ghosts much more scary. So, the ones that stick in my imagination are the Woman in Black, Rebecca. I love a female ghost. I just think they're much more terrifying. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why. Why do you think they're more terrifying? It's interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I wonder if it is this idea that we've been led to expect that, a female figure will be kindly and motherly and not dark. And it's that juxtaposition, this sudden reverse of what we've been led to expect, that frightens us. I don't know.
Yeah, and I wonder if we're talking in traditional roles here, the very traditional male-female roles, but most of us were raised in that sort of world. So I wonder about this as a female viewer or reader. We are taught from a young age that men are the threat. If we are to suffer any kind of a threat, it's probably from a man. So then is it more frightening when it's a woman that we're told to trust? Because I remember as a child, my mum telling me, if you're lost, find a lady, preferably who's got a buggy, got a child with her, and say to her, I'm lost, can you help me? Because a woman like that certainly will be no danger. So then it's frightening if she is the danger.
That's so true. And I wonder if that's the same. I'd be really actually interested to get a male author on this panel as well and say, do you find female ghosts more scary, or do you find the male ghosts more scary? What? I mean, I'm not saying a male ghost can't be scary. There are some terrifying ones, but the ones that haunt me are, I think, like you say, this woman that's meant to be beautiful and non-threatening, and the person you go to if you're in trouble is actually after you.
Never think about it. A mother ghost is, I've seen that a few times, and I wonder if that is the ultimate horror, like the mother who is meant to be the one who is protective. And we do have this idea that someone who is a mother should be protective of everyone, not just her own children, but all people. And then if she's not.
Well, I've seen what was it? I think it was a book called This House is Haunted, where the mother is the ghost, but she's too protective. She's kind of too good a mother, and she doesn't want anybody to get near her children after she's dead. So it's kind of brilliant because it turns that idea on its head. It's actually her protectiveness and her good mothering skills after death are the problem, because she starts killing all their nannies.
Okay, now that leads me on to something that I really want to ask you, which is, do you think then that all horror, or the majority of horror, is a good thing flipped around?
Yeah, I do love a reversal. I mean, we were talking about violence against women, and in The Shape of Darkness, I think I've mentioned a lot of people get murdered, but honestly, about 90% of these people are men. And it was quite funny to do that. Let me just clarify, it's not funny that people get murdered. These are fake people. These are fake people that get murdered. They're not real. No murder is funny, but fake murder. um it did just seem quite refreshing to be able to write that, each time. And I always like stories that kind of start off playing up to the tropes, and then they just suddenly turn it on its head to something you haven't expected. And I like to see gender swapped stories, things like that. It's really interesting to me. What
Yeah,
about to you?
yeah, no, I love a trope turned around. Actually, that's something that I was really trying to do in Things We Say in the Dark, because it's in three parts. There's stories about houses, stories about children, and stories about kind of the past or being a child, which is where the one that I read came from. And there's also a frame narrative. So there's a little introduction at the start that's about me, Kirsty Logan, telling you, the reader, about how I'm in Iceland, I'm on this residency, I'm writing a book about scary stories, about the things that frighten me. And then after each story, we come back to this narrator character who I've said is me, but is it? Maybe not. And that's what I really wanted to do with that, is that I used to love, you probably remember the TV shows like Are You Afraid of the Dark?
Yes, I love that.
So the things that had a sort of frame narrative of, kids around a campfire, kids at a sleepover, something like that. And then after each story, you would come back to them, and it was almost a comfort, because you would think, it would remind you that it's just a story. You would think, this is just a story that they're telling each other, and they're fine, therefore it's safe to some extent. So that's what I wanted to set up with this, is I'm going to go to some scary places, I'm going to have some scary stories, but it's okay, I'll get you back. At the end of each story, I will remind you
Oh
that
yeah.
story. But then I wanted to play with that, because I won't say what happens, but as the book goes on, the reality of that starts to shift. And I wanted there to be this slow realization that you think, that can't have happened. That can't be real. This must be a story. And then, so as you go on, it's like you thought you had this steady ground, or you thought you had this comfort, and it's taken away.
Yeah, your anchor is suddenly not trustworthy at all. The thing that was pulling you to the real world is like, oh no, it's crazy.
I like that. I like that. But we are coming up on time, but I would love to just hear a little bit more about the spiritualism, because we mentioned ectoplasm. And I always find this really fascinating. We've already opened the door to talking about childbirth and periods, so we might as well do, I don't know if you have a favorite fact. I'm going to do my favorite spiritualism fact when I was
Yeah,
researching.
go for it.
the ectoplasm that you might have seen in pictures, which is this kind of very gauzy, strange substance that some spiritualists, they would get muslin, which you can fold down, pack it in very, very, very small, and they would hide it in their vaginas because nobody would find it, right? Nobody would see it there because
not going to be looking there.
Nobody's going to look there. Because even sometimes they would be, and this is actually what led me to write the story that was in the book, is that I had read this description of these learned men of science who considered it their important duty to science to make sure that the women weren't hiding anything. So they would like run their fingers through the women's hair. They would like touch their waists and kind of touch around their cleavage just to make sure they weren't hiding anything. It's very important to do this for science, which of course now wouldn't be okay, but in Victorian times was completely unheard of. You would never do that to a woman that you didn't know.
Having a grope in the name of science, that's what it is.
Well, sometimes the mediums would sit on their laps so that they couldn't kind of do it. So strange. And I took that really to an extreme, and this man becomes completely obsessed with this teenage girl who he thinks is putting one over on him. How dare this mere girl know more than him, a grown man who should have all the answers and know everything. So he becomes dangerously obsessed with finding out what it is that she's hiding. But I didn't actually manage to get her to have muslin in her vagina. But I just loved this idea that all these Victorian people, they were kind of pulling this stuff out of their vagina and being like,
I was going to say, like, just the logistics of that. How do you extract that subtly? That's so strange.
That's my favorite.
But yeah, I mean, I love all the facts about spiritualists, and I think one of my favourites was a Mrs. Guppy who had things raining from the ceiling, and she really went overboard. You know, a lot of people were using like petals and just gentle things falling down from the spirits, and she had like live fish and seaweed and all these sea creatures and loads of water, and I just thought that's brilliant. I love it. It's like going on a theme park ride and just being drenched. But also I think, like you said, the kind of sexual element of the seances, where, you know, I spoke previously about women finding some power in mediumship, but also there were men very keen to then become their patrons and take over this woman, and like you say, sit them on their lap, do sort of really weird things like tie them up. They loved to tie the mediums up in the closets to prove that they weren't doing things like pulling things from their vagina. But they used to, you know, like tie them up and seal them with wax, and all these silk scarves they'd used to tie them. It really had this worryingly sort of semi-erotic undertone. And one of the mediums produced what, you know, a ghost, and her patron kind of sat the ghost on its lap, and to make sure it was real was kind of checking and feeling its hip bones and everything, you're touching it to make sure it was real in his mind, but touching it in ways that you really didn't need to. It's it's this really weird undertone to everything that kind of has this added air of threat, I think, as well as the ghosts.
Well, actually, speaking, I don't know if this came up in your research as well, but speaking of a female monster, when I was researching the Radio 4 show, it was called A History of Ghosts, by the way, and you can watch it on Catch Up, listen to it on Catch Up if you want to. I read that Mrs. Guppy was incredibly jealous of Florence Cook because Florence Cook was very young and beautiful. And did you hear about her plan, her acid plan?
No, please tell me. I know we haven't got too much time, but I want to know the acid plan.
She was so jealous of Florence Cook and her beautiful spirit guide, Katie King, that she hatched this plan. So she said, well, I can't go to the seance myself because I should be recognized because I'm so famous. So she convinced, or tried to convince, her husband to go to the seance and throw acid on Katie King, who was the kind of spirit.
The ghost, yeah.
To prove that she wasn't a ghost, to prove that she was actually Florence Cook in disguise. I will say he didn't actually go through with it, but that is to the extent that she was willing to go.
And I mean, also completely unnecessary, because you just have to look at the photos of of Katie King and Florence Cook side by side, and they're clearly the same person. But that's just awful.
Like, if you want to believe it, then you believe it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's true. But God, acid, that's awful. But
No, she didn't. She didn't actually manage to do it, but she did send, I think, her husband or a friend of hers along to one of the seances, and he managed to grab hold of Katie Kane.
Ghost grabber. Yeah.
Yeah, he was the ghost grabber, but apparently he suffered for it, and that she basically attacked him and like pulled some of his beard out.
I like this ghost.
Kind of serves him right, to be honest.
It does. It really does. But no, you're right. It's just like you say. There's all these dark jealousies and rivalries going on under the surface. It's just amazing.
Very dramatic. Okay, I'm gonna just end on. I would love to know a bit about your favorite scary stories. So anything that you've been watching, reading, or any kind of classic ghost stories or anything. What kind of scary stories have you been enjoying?
Do you know, there's so many, and it gets hard to remember them all. I started to try and think what I read last week, and I can't remember. But the one that's really I've been saying in every interview, the one that's really stuck with me from this year has been The Book Collector by Alice Thompson. So it's not so much ghostly, but it's very much focused on female fears, and it's about a woman who marries a widower, uh, and he is a book collector, as the title suggests, but he's very secretive and strange about a particular book, and she starts to find out more and more about him, and thinks that she's going mad herself, but she might not be. And there's some books covered in human skin, and it's just great. It's just a brilliant book.
Wow. That sounds.
Not an eloquent description of it, but it's really good. I would definitely read it. What about you? What have you been reading?
Well, I've been consuming a lot of horror recently. It's strange. It's like as the world outside becomes more and more horrible, I retreat into horror, which is kind of strange. My wife and I have been watching the TV shows Hannibal and The Haunting of Hill House, and I loved both of them. And next up, we're going to watch The Terror because I've heard that's great. I enjoyed the book years ago. And the novel that I'm writing right now is a ghost story set in the Arctic, and The Terror is in the Arctic. So I can even say it's research, right?
Okay, firstly, send that story to me as soon as you're done with it. That sounds amazing. And also, is the Terror streaming anywhere, or have you bought it like on DVD? Because I've been trying to watch it for ages.
I think it's on Sky. I haven't actually looked into it, but I'm pretty sure it's on Sky.
Because Kieran Hines is in it, and I'm a big Kieran Hines fan.
Should be good. And also, I've heard it's not. I don't. Oh no, that's not true. This is also on Sky. Lovecraft County, which I've heard is
That's
brilliant.
meant to be brilliant, isn't it?
Watch that as well.
There's too much good horror to watch.
Too much. And also in terms of books, every year I do 31 Days of Female Horror, and I recommended your book last year for this, but it's on my
Thank you.
Twitter. It's on my pinned thread is 31 recommendations of female horror that I like to do every year. And I'm already starting to think about what I'm going to do next year, what books I will recommend next year, because it's so much fun. Anyway, we could honestly talk for hours, but we are
Probably
going.
will after this is over.
But thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for joining. I hope it was interesting. I hope you feel horrified in the best possible way.
And
And
please buy
yeah,
Kirsty's book through Waterstones,
yeah.
and pre-order The Shape of Darkness through Waterstones. It's out in January, so that's really soon. You won't have long to wait.
And people can pre-order now, right?
They absolutely can.
Great. And yeah, and Things We Say in the Dark is just out in paperback. So you can pick up the paperback if you want to. And thank you very much, Laura. And thank you, everyone.
So lovely to see you. Bye.